Alright, so today I want to show you some of the more common ball python supers. And if you're not familiar with supers, essentially what it is, it's where a ball python has two copies of a co-dominant gene. So for example, if you actually took two pastels, you breed the two pastels together, 25% of the time you'll get a super pastel. And some of these supers, it's really tricky, I'd say. Some of them are kind of building blocks where you can add more genes on top of them and actually get more impressive combinations. And some of them, we kind of say in the ball python industry, they're kind of dead ends. So for example, if you make a super that's an all white snake and you try to add more genes on top of it, a lot of times you'll actually get just an all white snake with kind of hidden genes in there. A lot of times we don't even know if the genes are in the snake. So I'd say if you're actually breeding some of those white snakes with a possibility where you can have other genes on top of it, especially if you have males, it's probably a good idea to actually hold those males back a year and then breed them to something else and then prove out the males, figure out what genes are in your white snake, and then a lot of times you can actually sell your snakes for a lot higher price because they have the extra genes in there. So it's kind of tricky when you're working with supers. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to jump over to the internet and I want to show you some of the potential and limitations of supers. Alright, so I want to jump over here on morphmarket.com and I want to start with the yellow belly. And the yellow belly is kind of interesting. As a matter of fact, it's a really subtle morph. It looks almost like a normal ball python's. Sometimes you can actually see some flaming coming up the sides. Sometimes the belly is a little bit yellow. I'd say in most cases it's not yellow. Sometimes it can be deceiving that, you know, you're looking for a yellow belly for a yellow belly. And the interesting thing about this is when you breed these two together, this is what you actually get. You get what we call an ivory, which is a super yellow belly, and it was one of the very first all white snakes on the ball python scene quite a few years ago. And the interesting thing is everybody was shooting for a white ball python at the very beginning. It was kind of like the holy grail of ball pythons. This was the very first all white snake to ever be produced, and these were actually selling for, I think it was over $100,000 at the time for an ivory. It was pretty amazing. Now to come to find out all these years later, we can actually produce an all white snake in a lot of different ways, not only with the yellow belly. But the interesting thing about this is I've seen a lot of people, as a matter of fact, if you go over to Morphmarket and kind of search through all the ivories, a lot of people actually list them ivory, possible pinstripe, possible chloral, possible all these other genes in the mix with the ivory, because once you mix in other genes in with the ivory, you don't really know if they're in there because it completely masks them with the all white snake. And this one's a little bit different than the snakes in the blue-eyed leucistic because the ivory has black eyes and it doesn't have the blue eyes in a blue-eyed leucistic. And a lot of times I'd say if you're looking for an all-white snake, the ivory is probably one of the ones that is probably not the brightest white. It's usually kind of a dirty snake, has some colors through it. Sometimes it'll actually have like this stripe on the top, and a lot of times it'll have like a discolored head. It won't be like the really bright white snake that you're used to, but it has some really powerful potential. You mix yellow belly with some other genes and it can make some really impressive combos, especially if you're going for like the freeways and the highways, or if you mix it, you know, with some of the like fire or pastel or orange dream, some of the really brightening. You add yellow belly on top of the really bright yellow and orange colors in a snake and it really enhances them and makes them pop. It's a really powerful gene. And you mix this with anything and you know all the offspring are going to be yellow belly. So there's really no guessing when you breed this to something else. Here is a fire, and I actually work with fire in my collection. I produced my first fires this year, came from a fire pied. It's like a lightning and enhancing gene. It really brings out some of the oranges and yellows if you mix it with orange dream or pastel or something like that. If you actually take two fires and breed them together, you get a super fire. And this is what a super fire looks like. It is another all white snake with black eyes. And kind of the interesting thing about the super fire is sometimes it'll have little splotches of yellow and sometimes it'll be a completely white snake. It's pretty awesome, and it always usually has black eyes. And this is another one, you add other genes on top of the mix and they kind of get drowned out from the white snake. It's hard to mix combos into a super fire. Here's another one. This is the lesser. The lesser is actually in the blue-eyed leucistic complex. So if you actually breed two lessers together, 25% of the time, you get an all-white snake with blue eyes. And this is a little bit different than the last two because it has the blue eyes. And I'd say the super lesser is probably one of the whitest, brightest snakes that you can get out there in the ball pythons. As a matter of fact, the super lessers are kind of known for having this weird anomaly. They have slightly bigger eyes than most, and most of your supers, like the super lesser and the super Mojave, they are both blue-eyed leucistics. But if you actually have a lesser Mojave, it's still an all-white snake. They consider that pretty much the premium all-white blue-eyed leucistic. If you have a lesser Mojave, it has pretty much normal eyes, the all-white snake with the blue eyes. Here's another one. This is a little bit different. This is the spot nose. The spot nose is a really subtle morph. It's really hard to tell the difference between a spot nose and a normal. Sometimes you can actually tell a little bit on the sides, but I'd say most of the times you can actually tell from the head stamp. The head pattern on a spot nose is pretty characteristic. If you have a normal looking snake and you have a really crazy head stamp or a head pattern on there, you probably have a spot nose. And if you actually take two spot nose and breed them together, you get what is known as a power ball. The power ball is a super spot nose. The super spot nose is kind of interesting because as a standalone morph, the spot nose really doesn't have a head wobble like the spider, but if you actually have two copies of the gene, some people say it's susceptible to some neurological issues, although I haven't actually bred it myself and I haven't talked to a lot of breeders to see what the percentage is or if it's really that big of an effect on the super spot nose. Sometimes it can be a really minor effect. And I'd say the Powerball is a really good place to build other genes on top of it. I've seen some really awesome Powerball combos. You take a Powerball, you start mixing other genes on top, and you can get some really amazing looking snakes. Here's another one. This is the Spark, and you probably haven't heard of the Spark. I'd say the Spark is kind of a unique gene. It's almost looks like a normal ball python. And usually when I think of Spark, what I think of is the Puma, which is the Spark yellow belly. It's a lilac mix in a snake. It's a really awesome looking snake. And the Spark by itself, as a matter of fact, if you take a Puma and you breed it to something else, a lot of times you can't tell if you actually have a Spark or a yellow belly because they look so close to each other and so close to a normal. So a lot of times I actually had a hard time just finding a Spark. Most of the times you come over here and it says Spark / yellow belly because they don't know if it's a Spark or a yellow belly. But if you actually take two Sparks and breed them together, take a look at what you get. This is a really awesome looking snake. This is the Super Spark, one of the most amazing supers just by itself. And this one, I'd say you could probably add some really interesting genes in here and kind of add some pattern and kind of mix it up a little bit. It looks like it's really visually dominant. You could probably see other genes on top of it. Probably not it probably won't cover up genes as much as like an all-white snake would, but I would say it's probably a good place to start adding other genes into the mix. Here's another one. This is actually a picture of Bobby, the snake I have around my neck on every video. This is a bamboo ball python. And if you actually take two bamboos and breed them together, believe it or not, the bamboo is in the blue-eyed leucistic complex. So you actually get an all-white snake with the blue eyes with the super bamboo. Kind of the same limitations as the other blue-eyed leucistic. You can't really mix other genes into the mix and see them on top of this. Here's another one. This is kind of an interesting gene. This is a coral glow, pretty much the same thing as a banana. People assume they're pretty much different lines of the same gene. They start out with more, I'd say, kind of an orange and yellow, kind of more intense colors as a hatchling. And then when they grow up, they kind of fade out a little bit and get all these little freckles, which is really interesting. And the really cool thing about bananas and coral glows is the gender of the offspring is linked to if the parents are male or female. So it's the male makers and the female makers. It's a really complicated, interesting kind of genetic anomaly with the coral glows and bananas. And if you actually breed two of them together, you get a super coral glow. And take a look at this. I actually pulled up a super coral glow that is an adult. So the first thing that struck me over here, a super coral glow, you see as an adult, it doesn't have any freckles, which is kind of interesting. And the other thing that's kind of interesting is when you actually hatch out the Super Coral Glow, it almost looks exactly like a regular Coral Glow. And only when it starts aging, you can tell the Super Coral Glow kind of fades out a little bit. And then the other one, just the straight Coral Glow with one copy of the gene, will start getting the little freckles in it. You can pretty much tell them apart that way. And if you breed a Super Coral Glow to anything else, you get all Coral Glows. And it's kind of interesting. I haven't really heard a lot of information on whether this would be a male maker or a female maker. It's kind of interesting because you'd have to start with a male and female. I'm assuming if you actually bred this, that all the offspring, probably half of them would be males and half of them would be females. It's probably even across the board. I haven't actually heard anyone, really explain, some of the breedings from the Super Coral Glows to see if statistically, if you're actually getting, a 50-50 mix of males and females. Here is the Rousseau. The Rousseau was pretty much one of the first blue-eyed leucistics on the scene. As a matter of fact, they used to call it het leucistic because it almost looks like a recessive gene because it looks so close to a normal. Come to find out, it's actually codominant because you can actually make some combos with Rousseau that are visual. It's not a recessive. Here's what happens when you mix two copies in one snake. This is called a white diamond, which is another blue-eyed leucistic. All white snake with blue eyes. Kind of hard to mix other genes in this and actually see any type of an effect on a blue-eyed leucistic. Here is an Enchi. Enchi is kind of an interesting gene because essentially what it does is it reduces the pattern and it really kind of wipes out all the alien heads. A lot of times you'll see on a lot of Enchis, it brings out a lot of yellow color in the snake. So there's certain lines of Enchi that have more reduction than others. Some are not as reduced as some of the other ones. Some are really bright yellow and some of them are almost like a normal looking Enchi. Here's what happens if you actually mix two of them together. You get a Super Enchi, which is probably one of my favorite building blocks for combos, the Super Enchi. And it's kind of interesting. I've actually seen some Super Enchis. I think it really depends on the line because if you take a look at this one, it almost has like stripes down the sides. I've actually seen some Super Enchis where it'll just have a little spot here, maybe like 3 or 4 little tiny spots on the top of the snake. As a matter of fact, I have a banana Enchi clown male. If you've taken a look at that snake, it almost looks like a Super Enchi. I've actually seen Super Enchis with more pattern than that, so it's kind of interesting. It seems like the different lines of Enchi have more or less reduction in pattern and the different colors. You can tell this one probably came from one that was probably like middle of the line reduction in one copy of the gene and was probably pretty yellow as a standalone morph. You mix two genes together, you can see the yellow is really coming out in this Super Enchi. Here's another one. This is the GHI. The GHI is actually a really dark morph. You mix it with other genes and it mixes really well. I'd say usually what it does is a lot of people when they're working with GHI, they try to bring out some of the highlights. So they mix it with lightning genes to where they get a really stark contrast between the lights and the darks in the snake. Usually the GHI will give you a really dark background as far as the background of the snake. You actually mix two GHIs together, you get a Super GHI. Looks almost like a GHI, but it's a little bit darker. It's kind of interesting. And I'd say this is really a good building block if you're looking for something in a dark morph. GHI works really well with a lot of combos. Here is the Mahogany. Speaking of king of combos, I think as far as dark morphs, Mahogany probably is hands down one of my favorite when it comes to mixing with other morphs. The problem with Mahogany is actually if you breed two Mahoganys together, you end up with a Super Mahogany. Take a look at this, and it's kind of completely opposite of the white snake. Now you have the black snake, and the black snake, I would say if you add other genes on top of it, it's kind of hard to actually break up the black. Although if you actually took this and you mixed in like pied or something like that, sometimes you can get really impressive combos with pieds with, the splotches of white coming through the Super Mahogany. I've actually seen some people making Super Mahogany pieds, which are pretty awesome. Here's another one, the black pastel. The black pastel is almost like the mahogany, but I would say it's a lot darker of a snake. So black pastel, I'd say, mixes really well with a lot of different genes. Here's what happens if you mix two copies of the same gene in one snake. You get what I think is probably the darkest and sleekest black snake in all of ball pythons. If you're looking for something really dark and black, this is it. As a matter of fact, I've seen some that are, I think it really depends on the line of black pastel. I've seen some almost completely black, and I've seen some that are kind of browned out, especially when they start maturing and aging. I've seen some really big ones that are almost like a metallic brown, really dark brown, almost like a copper color. It's really awesome. And the thing that I really like is just how it's so dramatic of a snake. The super black pastel, I would think there's probably not a lot you can do with this other than mixing it with pied, and that is pretty much hands down the best pied combo you can get is the panda pied. The black and white snake from the panda pied comes from the super black pastel. Here's another one. This is the chocolate. The chocolate's another dark morph. You can see it's kind of close to a normal. I actually have some normals that almost look as dark as this, but if you actually mix two chocolates together, you get a super chocolate. And the interesting thing about this, it's not as quite as jet black as some of the other ones. It's really dark, and you can actually, looks like you can actually mix some genes in with this and get some impressive results. I haven't actually done a morph study on the chocolate yet. It's one of the last ones that I'm wanting to do and go through and see what the potential of the chocolate is. But just looking at the super chocolate, a lot of times, sometimes if you just look at the supers, you can actually start adding other genes on the super and see what effect the super has, and kind of go down the road of producing everything in a super in your collection instead of trying to work with just the base gene. Sometimes that's a really impressive way to go. Here's another one. This is the pastel. I'd say this is pretty much the bread and butter of the ball python industry. If you go anywhere, you'll probably see pretty much in everyone's table there is something pastel, something on their table. They pretty much everyone works pastel, and essentially what it is, pastel brings in the yellow color, and a lot of times it reduces the pattern or kind of jumbles up the pattern. Sometimes you lose a lot of the alien heads. It's kind of unpredictable. Sometimes it kind of turns into these keyholes, but that's not always the case. Sometimes it really jumbles up the pattern. Here's what happens if you mix two pastels together and you get the super pastel. Take a look at this. As a matter of fact, I just did a morph video on the super pastel, and just starting with the super pastel, adding other genes on top of it. And let me tell you, if you want some really super impressive snakes, you can actually start with a base of super pastel, start adding other genes on top of it, and you get some phenomenal combos. I'm almost tempted, to start a whole rack of all super pastels and just have all super pastel combos. That would be really awesome. Here's another one. This is an asphalt, and when you're thinking about asphalt, it's kind of tricky because the first thing you think about is the freeway. The freeway is actually an asphalt yellow belly, and it's an allelic combo. It looks really impressive, but the problem is if you actually take a freeway and you breed it to, say for example, a normal, you'll get snakes that are they're either asphalts or yellow bellies, and there's a 50-50 chance because it's allelic, so you won't get any normals. And a lot of times you actually come over here on Morphmarket and they'll be listed as asphalt / yellow belly, because we know it's one or the other because of the breeding, but we just don't know which one it is, and they look really almost like a normal ball python. You almost can't tell the difference between this and a normal. But this is what happens if you actually take two asphalts, you breed them together, you produce a super asphalt. And take a look at this. This is obvious that this is a super asphalt. It is probably one of the most stunning snakes that I've ever seen. As a matter of fact, super asphalts are really expensive. This one actually sold for $4,500 in the end of 2019. Pretty amazing snake. They bring in a lot of money. This is actually kind of the highway and the freeway projects. That's kind of one of the ones that I'm really wanting to get into, but you only have enough space for so many snakes, and you get to the point where you just can't do it all. You have to kind of pick and choose what you're working on. Here's another one, the Mystic. The Mystic's kind of interesting. If you take a look at this snake, it almost looks like a normal. You can see kind of the keyholes in the side a little bit. The Mystic is a really subtle morph. Then the funny thing is, if you actually take two Mystics and breed them together, it's actually in the blue-eyed leucistic complex, but the Super Mystic isn't an all-white snake with blue eyes. This is what a Super Mystic looks like. It looks like, it definitely has pattern, almost looks like a purplish colored snake with some of this yellow right down the top. And it's kind of interesting, some of these genes in the blue-eyed leucistic don't always produce the all-white snake unless you mix them with the right genes. So for example, if you actually take the Mystic and you breed it with, I actually did a study on this where you take the Mystic and you breed it to, you know, all the different genes in the blue-eyed leucistic. It's like half the time you get a white snake, half the time you get a snake that kind of looks like this, kind of a purplish colored snake with some of this different pattern and yellow lines coming down the top. It's kind of interesting. And as far as mixing other genes on top of this or on the Super Asphalt, I would think it would really be awesome to actually mix some other genes in with these combos. So here's another Orange Dream, and this is another one where if you want a whole collection of really impressive snakes, you can actually start with the Super Orange Dream and just start adding other genes on top of Super Orange Dream. It's almost like, I'd say probably this one and Super Anchi would probably be one of the most, and the Super Pastel, those are probably the three out of all these that I would choose is if I was to build a whole collection on top of a Super. And the interesting thing about the Orange Dream is there's different lines of Orange Dream. Some of them are really intense, really bright, and then some of them are kind of dulled out. I actually pulled up a Super Orange Dream over here that is pretty intense. I've actually seen snakes that are even brighter than this, and it's almost like a yellowish, kind of an orangish copper, mostly yellow, I would say, in a lot of these Super Orange Dreams. Now let me tell you, if you start adding other genes, if you actually take like a Super Orange Dream and then put on like Super Pastel, Super Enchi, and Spider, I mean, these just like explode with color. It is so amazing, some of these Orange Dream combos. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Gwendolyn Wheeler asks, will you have any bamboo lessers hatching out this year? And that is a very good question. As a matter of fact, I probably won't have any bamboo lessers hatching out. It's actually an all-white snake with blue eyes. And in order to get that, I need to breed one of my bamboos to one of my lesser females. I actually have two lesser females. They're both taking the year off. One of them laid really late last year, and then this year, one of them was a really picky eater. So I don't know if I'm actually gonna get to the point where I'm breeding those next year. Hopefully they'll both be ready next year. They're kind of looking kind of on the edge, maybe. It's always frustrating trying to get snakes up to weight by the time it's breeding time. And I'd say I am actually going to produce some lessers this year. And the way I'm doing that is I have my bamboo lesser male. I'm breeding it to 3 normal females. So hopefully one or more of those females will actually lay eggs. And out of those, I'll get half bamboos and half lessers. And the bamboos will actually be Bobby's grandchildren. I can't believe he's actually going to be a grandpa now this year. It's pretty awesome, actually breeding some of his offspring back to my females. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.